Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a mission to, cut through the noise and understand something truly transformative. How games can become powerful, proven tools for learning. For those of you like our listener who come from the vibrant world of elementary education, you already understand the magic inherent in play. You see it daily, right? In your classrooms, on playgrounds, the way children become completely absorbed, the sheer joy of discovery, their incredible persistence in mastering a new skill, even if it takes, countless tries. But what if we could intentionally harness that magic, not just for engagement, but for tangible academic growth?
Precisely. And that's what we're diving into today. We're going to pull back the curtain on the science behind game-based learning, delving into the foundational research from a leading handbook in the field. Our goal isn't just to define terms, it's to extract the core insights from rigorous scientific experiments, showing you how our brains actually learn through play, and revealing the research-backed features that genuinely make games effective for, measurable academic change. And yes, as you mentioned, we'll keep our lens firmly on the elementary classroom. We'll explore how these theories and findings translate directly to young learners and their unique developmental stages.
Okay, fantastic. So if you've ever wondered how to make learning truly stick, how to captivate young minds beyond just a fleeting moment of fun, or simply how to leverage that intrinsic joy of play for serious academic gains, well, this deep dive is for you. We're going to give you a roadmap, sort of, for identifying and maybe even thinking about designing games that don't just entertain, but profoundly educate. Okay, let's unpack this, honey. Demystifying game-based learning, the core building blocks. All right, let's begin with a clear definition because game-based learning is thrown around a lot. It's definitely more than just, playing a game in class as a reward or a time filler. What, according to the research, truly makes it learning? What's the fundamental cognitive shift we're really aiming for?
Right. Fundamentally, game-based learning occurs when playing a game causes a change in the player's academic knowledge. And that includes cognitive skill. This isn't just about entertainment, though that can be part of it. It's about an intentional, measurable shift in what a player knows or can do, directly resulting from their game experience. So if we break that down, first, learning itself means a change in the learner. They are different somehow after the experience. Second, what changes is their knowledge. Could be a fact, a concept, a procedure, even a belief about their own ability, actually. And third, critically, this change is caused by their specific interaction, specifically playing a computer game in this context. So for you in elementary education, think about it this way. A classroom game isn't merely a fun activity, it's a deliberate instructional tool. It's designed to alter a child's understanding. It's about more than just engagement, which is important, but it goes deeper. It's about cognitive transformation. It's about designing an experience where the very act of playing the game literally reshapes and expands their understanding of a subject.
Okay, so it's not just play, it's purposeful play. That makes a lot of sense. And the research also dives into how our brains actually process these games, right? Which I imagine is absolutely critical for understanding why some games work wonders and others, maybe fall flat.
Exactly. That's the core of the cognitive approach. Our brains have limited processing capacity. Think of it like mental bandwidth. There's only so much attention and processing power available at any given moment. When we play games, this capacity is constantly being allocated to different types of cognitive processing. And understanding these types is absolutely key to designing truly effective educational games, especially, for young, developing minds whose mental bandwidth can be, let's say more easily overloaded. The first type is generative processing. This is the prime goal. This is the good stuff we really want to maximize. It's the cognitive processing aimed at making active sense of the material, and it's driven by the player's motivation. Okay, so imagine a science game for, say, third graders, like that design a plant example in our source. Children design a plant to survive on a new planet, choosing roots, stems, leaves based on climate conditions. Now, when they're actively making these choices and seeing the outcomes, maybe their plant thrives with wide leaves in a rainy climate, or it loops in strong winds. They're engaging in generative processing. They're motivated by the challenge, right? Making their plant survive. And that drive fuels their understanding of cause and effect in plant biology. They're not just passively absorbing information, they're generating meaning, building connections, truly grasping the underlying principles. Then we have extraneous processing. This is the mental effort that doesn't support the instructional objective. It's the opposite, really. It's often caused by distracting overly glitzy features, the kind of stuff common in many games. So if that same Design a Plant game had constant irrelevant flashing lights or characters popping up for no reason, or loud distracting sound effects totally unrelated to plant growth, a child's brain would be spending precious cognitive capacity on that noise instead of the science content. Ah, okay. So that's the mental clutter you mentioned. It actively works against learning.
Exactly. It's extraneous processing. Our goal as designers, or even as teachers choosing games, is to ruthlessly minimize this. And finally, there's essential processing. This is the foundational cognitive effort. It's what's needed simply to mentally represent the core material in working memory. It's the effort required just to take in the basic information. For our Design a Plant game, this would be the mental effort a child exerts to remember the different types of roots presented, or to understand what climate means within the context of the game. It's that initial decoding and comprehension of the raw data. So the crucial balancing act here is this. If too much cognitive capacity gets devoted to that extraneous processing, the distractions, the irrelevant flashy elements, there just isn't enough left for essential processing, and especially not for generative processing. And those last two are absolutely vital for meaningful learning.
You can have the most engaging game in the world visually, but if its gamey features are just noise, it's not facilitating learning effectively.
No.
It's a very delicate dance between fun and function.
That distinction between purposeful cognitive work and mere mental noise is so important. It really clarifies why some games that seem super fun might not actually be educational at all. It also makes me think about how we structure any learning experience, honestly, not just digital games. This seems to point to having a clear purpose, a clear learning goal being central to everything.
Indeed, it really does. And the cognitive approach to game design hinges on three interconnected components that every educator knows well: learning, instruction, and assessment. Their application within game-based learning just has a specific and, I think, powerful nuance. So learning, as we've discussed, is defined as that measurable change in knowledge that results directly from playing a game. In our Design a Plant example, the ultimate goal is for the learner's knowledge about plant growth to change. They should form a mental model of how water and sunlight affect growth and survival. Or think about a math game where kids learn about fractions. Learning occurs when, after playing, they can identify equivalent fractions more accurately, maybe faster than they could before. It's a demonstrable shift.
Okay, learning is the outcome. What about instruction? How does that fit in?
Right, instruction. This is the manipulation of the environment intended to cause learning. And crucially, asking someone to play an academic game is a form of instruction. It's not just free play. This means academic games must have clear learning objectives. You need to know what specific knowledge is to be learned and how that learning will be assessed. So for elementary school, you're not just picking a random fun game. You're choosing one explicitly designed to teach, say, multiplication facts, with a clear objective like, by the end of this game, you will be able to solve multiplication problems up to 12 by 12 with 90% accuracy. The game itself serves as the instructional delivery mechanism.
Got it. So the game is the instruction, and then assessment. How do we know if it worked?
Exactly. Assessment. How do we determine what the learner knows? How do we actually know if learning has occurred because of the game? This can happen in a couple of really powerful ways in games. First, there's embedded assessment, sometimes called stealth assessment. This is built right into the game itself. Often the player doesn't even realize they're being assessed. It feels natural, part of the gameplay. For instance, Design a Plant might subtly track how many tries it takes a student to successfully create a plant that thrives in a new environment. Or maybe how many incorrect root choices they make before selecting the right one for the climate. This reveals their growing understanding without needing a formal, separate test.
Oh, that's brilliant for the classroom. It doesn't interrupt the flow of play, which is huge for younger kids.
Exactly. A phonics game could track a child's accuracy and speed at sounding out new words. A problem-solving game could record their strategy choices, showing if they're moving from just guessing to more systematic approaches. Second, there's external assessment, which are the more formal post-tests outside the game that you're likely more familiar with. And within external assessment, we often look at two types. Retention tests measure what can be remembered, the facts, the names, the definitions. Did they learn the state capitals? And then there are transfer tests. These measure how well knowledge can be applied to new situations. This is often the deeper goal. For our Design a Plant game, a transfer test might show a new plant, one that wasn't in the game, and ask the learner to describe the best environment for its growth. This requires them to apply the principles they learn, not just recall facts about the game plans.
Okay, I see. So for elementary kids, maybe after playing a geometry game, you might ask them to find geometric shapes in the classroom, or draw a new shape with specific features.
Precisely. Showing they can apply what they learned beyond the digital screen. That's transfer.
It's really striking how knowledge, that change in knowledge, is absolutely foundational here. So does this mean any game, as long as it changes knowledge, counts? Or there's specific types of knowledge the research has found games are particularly good at teaching?
That's a great question because, educational games aren't just for rote memorization like flashcards on a screen. They can actually target a really wide spectrum of knowledge types, from very basic recall all the way up to deep, abstract understanding. Our source highlights 5 distinct categories, which I think really expands our thinking about what games can accomplish in the classroom. First, there's factual knowledge. This is the most straightforward. Basic, discrete statements about the world, like knowing the capital of France is Paris. For elementary students, this is your geography game, where children learn the names of continents or state capitals. Or a game helping them memorize addition or multiplication facts. It's about pure recall.
Okay, basic facts. Makes sense.
Second, conceptual knowledge. This goes a step deeper. It focuses on categories, schemas, principles, models, understanding relationships. An example might be understanding that current decreases in a circuit when resistance increases, which is a fundamental principle. In an elementary context, this could be a game where students categorize animals by their habitat, forest, desert, ocean. They're learning the concept of a habitat and the relationships between living things and their environment. Or maybe a game where they interact with various characters in a town and learn the concept of community helpers, how doctors, firefighters, teachers all contribute to society in different but interconnected ways. It's about understanding those relationships and frameworks.
So moving beyond just facts to understand the why and how things fit together.
Yeah, exactly. Third, procedural knowledge. This involves knowing how to do something, step-by-step processes, like solve for IFV20 and R10 in the formula IVR, knowing the steps to apply the formula. For elementary students, this is incredibly useful. Think of a math game that teaches the multi-step process for long division, guiding them through each step patiently. Or maybe a sequence game for storytelling, where children learn the procedural steps of plot development, beginning, rising action, climax, resolution. Right, the how-to knowledge. That's practical. Fourth, we have strategic knowledge. These are more general methods or heuristics for problem solving, thinking about how you approach a problem. An example from the source is, when solving an equation involving Ohm's law, draw a diagram. Or the broader strategy of restating a problem in your own words. These are metacognitive strategies thinking about your own thinking. For elementary learners, a reading game might prompt children to, say, look for clues in the picture, or reread the sentence when they encounter a new, unfamiliar word. It's teaching them a comprehension strategy. Or a problem-solving game could encourage them to think about what you already know before trying to solve a new challenge. These are transferable skills that help students approach problems across different subjects.
I like that. Building those strategic thinking muscles early on.
Yes. And finally, beliefs. This might seem surprising, but games can powerfully influence a learner's thoughts about learning itself, like fostering the belief that I am good in science. For elementary students, this is absolutely critical. Building resilience, a growth mindset. Imagine a game that celebrates small successes. It offers encouraging feedback with positive affirmations. Instead of just saying correct, it might say, wow, you tried so hard and got it. That's amazing. This builds a child's confidence and self-efficacy, making them genuinely believe I can learn math or I am a good reader.
Yeah, those positive self-beliefs are so foundational for sticking with things when they get tough.
Absolutely. And games often offer a safe space for trial and error, which directly feeds into building these positive beliefs. Failure in a game feels less threatening than failing on a worksheet sometimes. 2. The brain's playbook. How learning happens in games.
Okay, understanding what games can teach, facts, concepts, procedures, strategies, even beliefs, that opens up so many possibilities. But for many teachers, myself included sometimes, the real question is, how? How does this transformation actually happen in a young learner's mind when they're deep in a game? Can we pull back the curtain on the brain's secret playbook here?
Absolutely. Let's look at the how. This explanation draws heavily on Mayer's cognitive theory of game-based learning, which is really built upon 3 fundamental principles of cognitive science. These principles apply broadly to all kinds of learning, but they have specific and really powerful implications for designing effective games. The first is the dual channels principle. This basically states that people have separate but interacting channels for processing visual information and verbal information. Think of it simply. Your eyes handle images and printed text. Your ears handle sounds and spoken words. But they don't just work in isolation. They work together.
Like when a teacher shows a picture of an animal and says its name at the same time.
Exactly. That's engaging both channels, and research shows that leads to stronger learning and better retention. Games are constantly doing this, combining visuals, animations, maybe sound effects, and often spoken narration. The second principle is the limited capacity principle. This one is crucial. People can process only a small amount of material in each channel at any one time. Our working memory, that temporary mental workspace where we actively hold and manipulate information, it has a bottleneck. It's not infinite.
Right. And for elementary students, that explains why a worksheet packed with too much tiny text and overwhelming pictures, or a game with just crazy visual clutter and too many instructions at once, it just shuts them down.
Precisely. Their working memory gets swamped. Less is often more for effective processing, especially for developing brains. We need to be mindful of that limited capacity. And the third principle is active processing. This states that people learn best not by passively absorbing information, like, pouring water into a glass. Instead, we learn by actively paying attention to relevant incoming information, mentally organizing it into a coherent structure, and then integrating it with relevant prior knowledge that's already stored in our long-term memory.
So it's not just soaking it in. Kids learn best when they're actively sorting, connecting, making sense of new information, linking it to what they already know.
Exactly. And games provide incredible opportunities for this active engagement. They demand interaction, decision-making, problem-solving, all of which are powerful forms of active processing. So if we kind of put these principles together, we can visualize what's happening inside the mind during a game. Imagine your brain has two input lanes, one for what you see, visuals, animations, printed words, and one for what you hear, spoken words, sounds. This information briefly hits your sensory memory. Then, if your brain pays attention, it moves into that mental workspace, your working memory. Here, you start building mental ideas from what you hear, forming a kind of verbal model, and mental pictures from what you see, creating a pictorial model. But the real learning, the deep stuff, happens when your brain actively connects these new verbal and pictorial ideas with each other and, crucially, with what you already know from your long-term memory. This integration weaves them into a richer, more comprehensive understanding. And finally, this newly constructed, deeper understanding gets stored away in your long-term memory, ready to be retrieved and applied later.
Wow. It really is like a mental construction project, constantly building and refining a mental map or model. That makes so much sense. And that brings us right back to those crucial cognitive loads we talked about earlier: extraneous, essential, generative. They're not just abstract concepts, they're directly tied to this mental construction process, aren't they?
Absolutely. They're happening during this process. During game playing, your limited processing capacity has to be allocated very carefully among those three types of processing. And understanding this allocation is paramount for effective game design, especially when designing for elementary learners. So first, extraneous processing. Again, this is the unproductive mental effort, the mental noise. A critical instructional design goal is to minimize it. Think about an elementary game designed to teach letter sounds. If it has unnecessary flashy animations popping up randomly or background music completely unrelated to the phonics task, a child's brain is spending precious capacity on those distractions. Designers should ruthlessly remove irrelevant elements or use visual cues to highlight only the key instructional material. Every element on screen really should serve a clear purpose related to learning. Second, essential processing. This is the necessary cognitive effort just to grasp the basic material to build those initial verbal and pictorial models in working memory. The design goal here is to manage it, make it as efficient as possible. For young learners, this could mean providing pre-training, like that quick lesson on key terms before they start the game. Or for emergent readers, presenting instructions in spoken form rather than relying only on printed text, which could create an unnecessary reading load that interferes with understanding the actual task. By managing essential processing, you make the foundational mental work easier, freeing up that limited capacity for the deeper understanding.
Okay, so minimize the noise, manage the basics.
And third, generative processing. This is the deep, meaningful processing where you truly make sense of the material, organizing it, integrating it with prior knowledge. The design goal here is to actively foster it. This is where well-placed design features really shine. Conversational language from an on-screen guide, remember Herman the Bug? Or an animated character with human-like gestures can make the game feel more like a helpful friend than a cold machine. That warmth and direct address encourages the child to engage more deeply, to maybe ask their own questions mentally, and to generate their own understanding. It prompts them to think, okay, what does this really mean? How does this connect to what I already know?
It's such a fine line, though, isn't it? That balance between engaging and distracting. I've seen games that are super engaging, but maybe not very educational, and vice versa. How do designers truly pinpoint that sweet spot? especially when games are inherently designed to grab attention.
It's a constant tightrope walk. Absolutely. If players use too much of their limited capacity for extraneous processing, they simply won't have enough left for the essential processing, and especially not for the generative processing needed for real learning. Games, with their inherent glitz and entertainment value, constantly face this challenge. It really comes down to designing every single element with a clear learning purpose in mind. And this brings us to a really powerful insight: the motivation question. Why games sometimes win. Games are often brilliant at fostering that deep generative processing precisely because of their motivational properties. They grab attention, they foster persistence, they make learning feel like play, not work. However, as we discussed, they can also create extraneous processing if they're not carefully designed. But here's the key insight, and it's a profound one for educators. If students aren't motivated, even the most efficient, direct instruction, like a perfectly organized, fact-packed slideshow presentation, probably won't lead to much learning because they simply won't engage with it.
Right, they'll tune out or just won't even try.
Exactly. They won't choose to participate, or they'll mentally check out after 5 minutes. Think about it. Most children wouldn't voluntarily choose to watch a, let's face it, potentially tedious slideshow presentation about plant biology in their free time. But they might choose to play a computer game that covers the exact same content, even if that game is, on paper, slightly less efficient in just raw information delivery per minute. In scenarios where engagement and persistence truly matter, where you need a child to choose to keep learning and stick with it through challenges, games often come out ahead. It's fundamentally better to have a student enthusiastically engage with a slightly less efficient lesson than to have them completely disengage from a highly efficient one. The power of intrinsic motivation, especially in elementary education, just cannot be overstated. 3. Evidence-based game design. What the research shows...
Okay, it's crystal clear that understanding the brain's processes and managing cognitive load is critical for game design. But this all still sounds a little theoretical, maybe. What does the actual hard scientific research tell us about what truly works in practice? What do the studies say about designing these games effectively, and maybe even about their effectiveness compared to traditional methods like worksheets or textbooks?
Right. This is where we transition from the cognitive theory to the empirical evidence. And our source highlights 3 main experimental research genres that provide robust evidence for what actually causes learning in games. These aren't just opinions or anecdotes. They're based on rigorous scientific principles like experimental control, random site assignment, appropriate measures of learning outcomes, all the good stuff. First, there's value-added research. This is designed specifically to identify which features of a game actually improve learning. Researchers typically compare a base version of a game to an enhanced version that has just one added feature. For example, they might compare playing a game where the narrator speaks in a formal third-person style versus the exact same game where the narrator speaks in a conversational first- and second-person style, you, we. This meticulous approach allows us to isolate the impact of that single feature on learning outcomes.
Okay, so testing one ingredient at a time.
Precisely. Second, we have cognitive consequences research. This genre examines whether playing an existing off-the-shelf game, like a commercial title, maybe one not even designed for education, like Tetris, improves particular cognitive skills that can then be applied outside the game. Does playing Tetris, for instance, make you generally better at spatial reasoning and other tasks?
Does playing this game make you smarter? Question.
Sort of, yeah, but focused on specific skills. And third, there's media comparison research. This asks the big question that many educators have. Is learning from a game more effective than, or maybe just as effective as, learning the same material through conventional methods, like narrated slideshows, videos, or textbooks? Are games truly a superior medium for instruction in certain areas, or are they just different?
Got it. 3 different lenses for looking at the evidence. So we're not just guessing, we're relying on science, with studies meticulously designed to show cause and effect. Let's dive into those value-added features first. What specific design choices give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of boosting learning?
Exactly. Value-added research helps us identify promising features that seem to have a high impact on learning, and just as importantly, unpromising features that don't seem to help or might even hinder learning. Starting with the promising features, high impact for learning. The modality principle is a really big one. The research consistently shows that people learn better when words in a game are presented in spoken form rather than only as printed on-screen text. For example, in that Design a Plant game, when Herman the Bug's explanations were spoken instead of just written text boxes, students learned significantly better. The research showed a median effect size of 1.41 across 9 different experiments. That's a massive effect in educational research, indicating really strong learning gains.
Wow, 1.41. And for young readers in elementary school, this seems huge. Having a friendly character speak the instructions or explanations reduces that cognitive load of reading and lets them focus their mental energy on the actual learning task, right?
Exactly. Imagine an interactive story game where the narrative is primarily spoken. It allows emergent readers to fully engage with the plot and concepts without being constantly bogged down by decoding complex text. Then there's the personalization principle. People learn better from games containing words in a conversational style using you, I, we, rather than a formal, detached third-person style. Remember Herman the Bug saying, "You are about to begin a journey," instead of something stiff like, "This program is about what type of plant survives." That conversational approach led to significantly better learning across multiple experiments with a median effect size of 1.54, another huge effect.
That makes intuitive sense, especially for young learners. Think of a math game where the narrator or an on-screen guide says, "Hey, you did great on that last problem, now let's try this together." Feels personal.
It does. It creates a feeling of direct connection, making the learning experience feel supportive, less intimidating, and much more engaging and relatable for children. It reduces that psychological distance between the learner and the content. The pre-training principle is also highly effective. People learn better when they receive some pre-game instruction in the key components or concepts needed to understand and succeed in the game. In the circuit game, example from the research, giving students a brief tutorial on basic electrical circuit principles and symbols before they started playing the game significantly improved their learning. The median effect size was 0.77 across 7 experiments, still a very strong effect.
Okay, so in the elementary classroom, this is super practical. Before starting a game on the water cycle, maybe just give a quick 5-minute mini lesson on what evaporation and condensation actually mean.
Precisely. It front-loads that essential knowledge. It ensures that when the child encounters these concepts in the game, they have a foundational understanding. It makes the game more accessible and effective for them, and it efficiently manages that essential processing load we talked about. Next up, the coaching principle. People learn better from games when they receive explanations and advice as they play. This isn't just about telling them right or wrong, but offering guidance or explaining why. For instance, in the circuit game, adding explanatory feedback after a student solved a problem, like a pop-up, explaining the underlying Ohm's law principle they just used, improved their performance on later transfer tests. This had a median effect size of 0.68.
So for young students, maybe a spelling game where instead of just a red X, a little coaching feature pops up and says, close. Remember, I often makes a long E sound, like in field.
Exactly. Or a friendly helper character provides hints when a child is stuck on a puzzle, guiding them towards the correct strategy rather than simply giving away the answer. This is crucial for guiding that important generative processing. And finally, the self-explanation principle. People learn better when they are prompted to explain their performance or their reasoning during the game. The research found this was especially effective when the response mechanics were simple, like selecting an explanation from a preset menu rather than having to type out a long answer. In the circuit game, prompting players to simply select a principle from a menu that explained their solution increased test performance significantly, with a median effect size of 0.81.
Okay, so for elementary kids, maybe after they complete a tricky math problem in a game, it could ask, "How did you get that answer?" And give simple options to click, like I added the numbers, I subtracted, or I used the counting on strategy.
Perfect example. It encourages children to articulate their thought process, which really deepens their understanding and reinforces their learning without being too burdensome.
It's fascinating how those seemingly subtle design choices, spoken words, conversational tones, simple prompts, have such a profound research-backed impact. But what about features that don't work as well, or might even get in the way of learning? This feels like it challenges some common assumptions about what makes a game good for education.
It absolutely does. And it's just as important for educators to know what not to include, or at least to be very cautious about features that might seem appealing but don't actually help learning. The research identifies a couple of key unpromising features. First, immersion, specifically virtual reality. Somewhat surprisingly, maximizing perceptual realism through highly immersive VR did not consistently improve learning outcomes in the studies reviewed. In fact, the median effect size was slightly negative, non-agassier 1 under 20.
Really? So all the hype about VR for education might be premature?
Well, it suggests we shouldn't assume that just because a game is in VR or has incredibly flashy, realistic graphics, it's automatically better for learning, especially for elementary school. If not designed very carefully, those highly immersive environments and hyper-realistic graphics can actually increase extraneous processing. They can draw attention away from the core instructional content and potentially overwhelm young learners. They might be mesmerized, sure, but not necessarily learning more deeply. The focus needs to stay on the learning goal. Second, redundancy, printed plus spoken words. Presenting both identical printed text and spoken narration of that same text simultaneously often resulted in poorer learning outcomes. The median effect size here was also negative, Mitico 0.23.
So putting the words on the screen while a character reads them aloud is actually bad. I see that all the time in kids' software.
It often is, according to this cognitive theory. The brain tries to process the exact same information through two different channels simultaneously, which can lead to cognitive overload, especially for young learners who are still developing reading fluency. It splits their attention. The advice based on the modality principle is, if a character is speaking the important information, let the visuals support it in other ways, but resist the urge to just put the exact same text on the screen. Let them focus on listening or reading, but not necessarily both for the same identical content at the same time.
Wow, that's a powerful takeaway. It's truly about thoughtful, cognitive science-informed design, not just throwing expensive technology or assumed best practices at the problem. So beyond these specific design elements within a game, what about the actual cognitive skills that games might build? Can playing a game like Tetris actually make a child smarter in a broader sense, outside of just playing Tetris?
Right. This is where that cognitive consequences research comes in. It investigates whether playing certain types of off-the-shelf games improves particular cognitive skills that can then be applied outside the specific game domain. The research shows a couple of pretty clear promising effects. First, there's strong, consistent evidence that playing certain first-person shooter, FPS, games like Unreal Tournament or Medal of Honor in the studies, significantly improves perceptual attention skills. Things like useful field of view, how much you can take in visually at once, and multiple object tracking, keeping track of several moving things simultaneously. The median effect size here is greater than 1.0, which is considered a large and robust effect.
Okay, but obviously we're not recommending FPS games for elementary school.
No, definitely not.
Right.
But the principle is highly relevant. It suggests that any game that requires rapid visual scanning, tracking multiple moving objects, or quickly identifying targets within a busy visual field could potentially build those underlying attention skills.
So maybe educational games that require kids to quickly spot specific letters or numbers amidst other distracting characters, or track multiple moving shapes on screen.
Exactly. It's the underlying cognitive demand, not the specific game theme, that seems to matter for building that skill. Second, playing spatial puzzle games like the classic Tetris shows moderate to strong evidence for improving 2D mental rotation skill. The median effect size is 0.68.
Okay, now that is directly applicable to elementary education. Games like Tetris, where children have to mentally rotate those falling blocks to fit the gaps, can strengthen spatial reasoning.
Absolutely. And that skill is foundational for things like geometry, understanding patterns, map reading, and even developing fine motor skills needed for handwriting or drawing. Simple block puzzle apps could be a great way to build this specific skill. However, it's crucial to note the specificity here. The research showed Tetris improved 2D mental rotation, but it did not show strong effects on 3D mental rotation or other broader spatial or perceptual skills. And this leads to the really powerful concept called the theory of specific transfer. The key takeaway here is crucial. Cognitive skills learned within a game domain only seem to transfer effectively to tasks outside the game if those outside tasks require the exact same underlying cognitive skill. And furthermore, that skill needs to have been exercised repeatedly in a variety of contexts and at increasingly challenging levels within the game itself.
So you can't just play a brain game for an hour and expect to be generally smarter across the board.
Pretty much, no. Don't expect a general brain training app to make a child universally smarter or better at everything. If you want to improve a specific skill, like 2D mental rotation, you need to find a game that targets that exact skill with lots of varied and progressively challenging practice. The research reviewed suggests many other general brain training games, real-time strategy games, or spatial action games often don't lead to broad, transferable cognitive skill improvements because they lack that focused, repeated, varied, and challenging practice of a specific underlying skill relevant to the transfer task.
Okay, specificity is key for skill transfer. Now let's tackle the big question for many educators. Are games actually better than traditional teaching methods, like a worksheet, a lecture, or a textbook chapter? Or are they just a potentially more engaging, maybe more expensive version of the same thing?
Right. This is what media comparison research aims to answer directly. It compares learning outcomes when students learn the same material from a game versus learning it via conventional media, like narrated slideshows, illustrated text, or maybe even traditional classroom instruction. The findings are actually quite promising, particularly in certain content areas. For science content, games often seem to be more effective. The review found 12 out of 16 studies showed positive effects favoring games, with a median effect size of 0.69. For example, the Design a Plant game generally showed better learning outcomes compared to a narrated animation covering the same material. However, there's a crucial caveat here, especially for elementary educators. The source also notes cases like games named Cache 17 or Crystal Island, where very complex adventure game narratives actually seem to distract students from the core science content. In those cases, learning was poorer than from a simple slideshow.
So the game itself can introduce extraneous load if not careful.
Exactly. So while virtual science labs or simulations where children can actively experiment with concepts like ecosystems or weather can be incredibly effective, you must be cautious if the game's story, characters, or extra non-instructional features overwhelm the core science concepts. Always keep the focus on the learning, not just the game aspects. Second language learning is another very promising area where games often show an advantage. The review found 4 out of 5 studies showed positive effects, with a really strong median effect size of 0.96. Think about learning Italian with an app like Duolingo versus using traditional slideshows. One study found Duolingo led to slightly better test performance, but significantly higher enjoyment and persistence. The effect size for enjoyment was 0.77.
That's a huge win for elementary. Games can be highly effective for teaching new languages, and crucially, they keep young learners motivated and persisting longer because they genuinely enjoy the experience. That sustained engagement is invaluable for language acquisition, which requires so much practice.
Absolutely. That enjoyment factor is not trivial. For mathematics, the research suggests games can be at least as effective and potentially even more effective than traditional methods. A study highlighted in the source involved a game called Decimal Point, where middle schoolers learned decimal fractions by engaging with virtual amusement park attractions. This game actually performed better than a standard computer-based tutoring system on both immediate and delayed post-tests. Effect sizes were 0.43 and 0.37, respectively. And importantly, the students rated the game as much more enjoyable than the tutorial system, effect size 0.95.
That's incredibly encouraging for elementary math teachers. A well-designed math game can be just as, or maybe even more effective than traditional tutorials or practice drills, while drastically increasing engagement and persistence for young students. It can make practicing those essential math facts feel less like a chore.
Exactly. It transforms the experience. For language arts and social studies, the source notes there wasn't enough conclusive evidence available in the studies reviewed at that time. However, importantly, there was no evidence suggesting that games were inferior to traditional methods in these subjects either. More research is definitely needed here. And this brings us back to the critical persistence factor. Even if, in some cases, games are only as effective as conventional instruction on a single test measuring immediate learning. The fact that students are often more likely to choose to play and persist longer with a game means it can lead to better overall learning outcomes over time.
Because they just spend more time learning.
Exactly. Engagement drives sustained effort. This aligns perfectly with Richard Clarke's famous admonition. Instructional media do not cause learning, but rather instructional methods cause learning. Quote, games aren't magic bullets because they're games. They're potentially powerful because they provide unique affordances for implementing effective instructional methods like immediate feedback, adaptive difficulty, personalized coaching, engaging practice, self-explanation prompts methods that might be harder or less engaging to implement consistently with traditional media. 4. Beyond cognition, the broader picture for learning.
Okay, it's incredibly clear that these cognitive processes, attention, working memory, cognitive load, are absolutely central to how game-based learning works. But, humans aren't just thinking machines, especially kids. What about feelings, motivation, confidence, even the social aspects of learning? How do those play into the effectiveness of games in the classroom?
You're absolutely right to bring that up. While our deep dive has focused heavily on the cognitive foundations, because that's where much of the rigorous experimental evidence lies, a complete understanding of game-based learning definitely requires acknowledging the vital role of emotional, motivational, and even sociocultural factors. They don't just add flavor. Research suggests they significantly impact learning outcomes as well. First, concerning the role of emotion, or affective factors. Research is increasingly showing that emotional design elements in learning environments do matter, and they can sometimes be just as effective as purely cognitive design principles. For example, one line of research looked at illustrations in science lessons, like explaining how immunization works or how a virus causes a cold. When the illustrations featured characters with clear facial expressions, used curved lines instead of sharp geometric shapes, and employed warm, appealing colors, students showed better comprehension and transfer compared to lessons using colder, more abstract geometric visuals. The effect sizes were quite strong, up to 0.77.
Wow. So how things look and feel actually impacts learning, not just engagement.
It seems so. For elementary classrooms, this is incredibly important. When you're choosing, or maybe even designing a simple game or activity, think about how the characters look, how the environment feels. Is it visually appealing, friendly, inviting? Creating an aesthetically pleasing, emotionally positive experience can significantly impact a child's receptiveness and engagement. Think about how much children respond to beloved characters in cartoons or picture books or bright, inviting visuals. That same principle applies here. An environment that feels safe and supportive, even just visually, can potentially reduce anxiety and open a child up to the learning process. Second, let's consider the power of drive, motivational factors. Similarly, features specifically aimed at improving motivation and building confidence can directly influence learning outcomes. For instance, studies have shown that lessons featuring on-screen pedagogical agents like friendly guide characters providing coping messages about managing feelings around learning ability. Things like, "It's okay to make mistakes, that's how we learn," or "This is tricky, but I know you can figure it out," led to better problem-solving performance and higher scores on post-tests. Effect sizes were up to 0.71. Other studies found that incorporating expressive writing prompts, where learners briefly reflect on their thoughts and feelings about the material, also improved performance.
So building that self-efficacy right into the game. Imagine a game for elementary students where a gentle, encouraging character pops up when a child struggles, saying, "It's tough, but you can do it. Take a deep breath. I know you've got this."
Exactly. Or maybe the game prompts them occasionally. How did that challenge make you feel? What did you try? These kinds of features can build resilience, perseverance, and that crucial intrinsic motivation in young learners, making them more likely to stick with challenging material instead of giving up. And finally, let's talk about learning in the real world, socio and cultural factors. All this powerful lab research is fantastic, but the big question remains: does it really apply to the messy, noisy, dynamic environment of a real classroom, with all its social interactions and practical constraints? The source emphasizes that this is a critical point. It stresses the importance of broadening research beyond these short-term controlled lab studies into authentic classroom settings and over longer periods. There is some promising evidence for generalization. For example, when medical school PowerPoint lectures were redesigned based on these core multimedia learning principles, students performed significantly better on their exams, with effect sizes up to 1.17. This shows these principles can translate effectively to real-world educational contexts, even complex ones.
Okay, so it's not just a lab phenomena.
Right. And this has direct relevance and points towards future needs in elementary education. The source specifically highlights that future research needs to explore. First, how to best integrate games effectively into routine school learning activities. How do they fit practically into your daily schedule and curriculum? Second, how to potentially expand learning time by including well-chosen game playing at home. How can games effectively bridge that school-home divide? And third, how to successfully involve groups or teams in game-based learning, moving beyond just individual screen time towards collaborative problem-solving and learning experiences using games.
So thinking about games not just as individual tools, but as part of a broader classroom ecosystem.
Precisely. It demonstrates that the principles we've discussed are not just for designing individual digital learning tools, but for architecting comprehensive, socially integrated learning experiences in your classroom that leverage the power of play in a much broader context. V-charting your course, implications for designing and choosing games.
This has been such a rich, deep dive into the science behind it all. So let's bring it home. If you're an elementary teacher listening right now, looking for new digital tools for your classroom, or maybe even thinking about designing your own simple game-based activity, what are the absolute non-negotiables? Based on all this evidence, what features should you prioritize when selecting a game, and what maybe should you be cautious about? What's the practical takeaway?
Okay, yeah, let's distill it down. Based on that strong value-added research, you have a pretty practical checklist you can use. When choosing or designing games, Prioritize those that. First, present important words in spoken form, especially explanations or instructions. That's the modality principle. This is vital for emergent readers, reducing cognitive load and focusing their attention on the content, not just decoding words. Second, use a conversational style. Personalization principle. Look for games that speak directly to your students using you and we. This fosters greater engagement and that crucial sense of connection. Third, provide some form of pregame instruction on key components or concepts, pre-training principle. This could be a quick intro video, a short tutorial level, or even just a clear explanation before the main game starts, ensuring students have the foundational knowledge they need to succeed. Fourth, offer explanations and advice as students play. Coaching principle. Look for games that provide meaningful, explanatory feedback. Not just right-wrong, but telling students why an answer was right or wrong, or offering helpful hints when they get stuck, guiding their learning process. And fifth, prompt students to explain their performance or choices, self-explanation principle, ideally with simple, easy-to-use input methods like selecting from a menu. This encourages that deeper metacognition without adding undue burden.
Okay, that's a great positive checklist. What about things to watch out for?
Right. On the flip side, be cautious of games that rely heavily on overly immersive virtual reality. If the learning objective doesn't specifically require that level of spatial immersion, as it can easily become a source of extraneous cognitive load and distraction. And definitely be wary of redundancy games that present both identical printed text and spoken narration of that same text simultaneously. Remember, the research suggests this can actually hinder learning by overwhelming the cognitive system.
So my practical checklist when evaluating an educational app or a digital learning platform for my classroom should really include questions like, does this game speak clearly to my students? Does it prepare them adequately? Does it offer helpful hints or explanations? Does it make them stop and think about why they're doing something?
That's an excellent summary of the key takeaways from the value-added research. Now, if your specific goal is to build a particular cognitive skill like improving spatial reasoning with puzzle games, or maybe attention skills, then the cognitive consequences insights are your guide. In that case, choose games that, first, require lots of repeated practice of that specific targeted skill. Repetition is key for building automaticity. Second, present that skill in a variety of contexts within the game, so the learning isn't just tied inflexibly to one specific game scenario. And third, make sure the game increases the challenge levels progressively, ensuring continuous growth and preventing boredom or frustration.
And don't expect general brain training from just any entertainment game that wasn't specifically designed for focused skill development with these features in mind.
Exactly. Specificity and structured practice are key for skill transfer. So if you want to improve fine motor skills and spatial planning, look for games that involve precise dragging, dropping, and rotating elements, similar to Tetris, rather than just any general logic game. And finally, when considering when games shine brightest, remember those media comparison insights. Learning with well-designed games can be as effective or even more effective than conventional instruction, particularly for certain science topics and definitely for second language acquisition. They are also very promising for mathematics, often leading not only to comparable learning gains, but also to significantly increased enjoyment and persistence.
For elementary teachers, this is incredibly empowering. It validates using games not just as a supplementary activity or a reward, but as a legitimate and often potentially superior instructional method for core subjects.
Yes, and leveraging their inherent motivational power means sustained engagement, which is just invaluable for young learners who might otherwise struggle to focus on more traditional, less interactive lessons. Games can truly transform a learning chore into a learning joy. 6. The road ahead. Future directions for game-based learning in education.
This field is clearly dynamic and still growing, with just so much potential for impact, especially in elementary education. So thinking ahead, what's next? What are the next frontiers for game-based learning research? And how might that directly shape what you, our listener, see and use in your classroom in the coming years?
That's a great question to end on. The source points to several crucial future directions for research in this area, and honestly, each one has direct implications for the elementary classroom. First, there's a strong and ongoing call for more replication studies. Science relies on replication. We need more studies to confirm and potentially generalize these initial, often promising, findings across different games, different student populations, and different learning contexts. A single study, no matter how well designed, isn't enough to make universal claims. Replications build confidence that these effects are robust. Second, researchers need to systematically identify boundary conditions. This means figuring out more precisely when a particular effect applies, and, just as importantly, when it doesn't. This includes critical questions like dosage, how much game exposure, how frequently is needed to produce significant and lasting learning gains. Is 10 minutes enough? An hour? And highly relevant for you, the age of the learners. Do these effects apply equally and in the same way to 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and adults? We need more research specifically looking at different developmental stages.
Yeah, knowing if these principles hold true for the specific K6 age range is crucial.
Absolutely. This research will directly inform how we fine-tune game design for the unique cognitive and developmental needs of elementary students. Third, there's a clear need to broaden the context of study. As we touched on, most of the compelling experimental research so far comes from relatively short-term studies conducted in controlled laboratory settings. Future research needs to move much more deliberately beyond these controlled environments into more authentic learning environments. The source specifically mentions classrooms and informal settings like museums or homes and examine learning over the long term, weeks or months, not just minutes or hours.
Yes. More research in actual elementary classrooms.
Yeah.
That would provide the most direct evidence for what really works in your teaching environment, considering all the real-world dynamics.
Exactly. Considering the dynamics of a full class, diverse learner needs, technology access issues, curriculum integration challenges, and the practicalities of a busy school day. Fourth, research needs to continue to sharpen its focus on learning outcomes. This means designing games with very clear, specific, and measurable learning objectives tied to particular knowledge components or cognitive skills, rather than having vague educational goals like improve science understanding. The better we define exactly what we want students to learn, the better we can design games to achieve it and measure success. And fifth, a greater focus on learning processes. This involves using more objective, fine-grained measures going beyond just pre- and post-tests or self-reported surveys to understand how learning is actually occurring during the gameplay itself. This could involve analyzing detailed in-game behavior logs. What did they click? How long did they pause? Using eye tracking to see exactly where students are focusing their attention on the screen, or maybe even using physiological monitoring to gauge engagement or cognitive load more directly.
Wow. Getting really detailed insights into moment-to-moment learning.
Yes. Understanding the process in more detail allows for even more precise and ultimately more effective game design in the future.
It really sounds like the scientific community is committed to truly honing these tools, moving from broad strokes and exciting potential to very fine-tuned, evidence-based, actionable details. That's really exciting for the future education technology.
It is. And while, sometimes visionaries or tech companies might make grand claims based on limited evidence or just flashy features, the scientific community, as represented in sources like this Handbook chapter, is really committed to rigorous, evidence-based research. The quest to effectively use games for worthwhile educational purposes will ultimately be much more successful the more it's grounded in a solid cognitive theory of how people actually learn. And for you, our listener, as someone entering elementary education, you are really at a unique and exciting intersection. You have that intuitive understanding of children's play, their motivations, their learning styles, combined with a growing knowledge of learning theory from your studies. You can be a vital part of this future evaluating games with a critical, informed eye based on principles like the ones we discussed, adapting them creatively for your specific classroom needs, and maybe even providing valuable insights from your own classroom experiences back to researchers or designers. Your practical observations can feed back into the scientific process, creating a powerful and productive feedback loop. Outro.
Wow, what a journey that was. From understanding how our brains actually process information when we're playing games, to dissecting the specific features that make a game truly educational based on solid research, and exploring the potential and pitfalls. It's abundantly clear that game-based learning is far more than just a passing trend. It's a powerful, evidence-backed approach to teaching that offers incredible potential to genuinely transform the elementary classroom experience for both teachers and students.
Indeed. And perhaps a key takeaway for you, our listener, stepping into the vibrant world of elementary education is this. The most engaging games, from a learning perspective, aren't always the flashiest or the most expensive. The truly effective ones are those that are carefully and thoughtfully designed to respect how the human mind actually learns. They work with our cognitive architecture, minimizing those distractions and maximizing that deep, meaningful engagement that leads to lasting knowledge and skills. It's really about smart, purposeful design, not just high production value.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your week, maybe as you're planning lessons or observing kids playing. Think about a simple game or activity you already use, or maybe one you could easily adapt in your elementary classroom. It could be a simple board game, a quick flashcard drill you make more interactive, or even a simple digital app you already have access to. Now ask yourself, what single design principle from our deep dive today, whether it's intentionally using more conversational language in your instructions, adding a quick pre-training activity before you start, or prompting children for a simple self-explanation after they solve a problem? What single tweak, guided by this cognitive science, could you intentionally add or modify to make that existing game or activity even more powerful for learning? Sometimes the smallest, most informed shift, guided by how we know kids learn, can make the biggest difference in fostering that deep, joyful, and lasting understanding.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep being critical consumers and creative adapters, and definitely keep playing.
That's all for this deep dive. We hope you feel a little more well-informed about the science of game-based learning and maybe a lot more curious about its potential in your future classroom.